This video represents a very brief introduction to some basic concepts related to animal biology, and will focus on animal form and function, specifically the relationship between surface area and volume, and also some basic concepts related to thermoregulation in animals. So let's begin with a brief discussion of this relationship between surface area and volume. Now we can think about this at the cellular level, at the organ level, for example, your lungs, which have a tremendous amount of surface area for gas exchange, and even at the entire organismal level as well. So this relationship between surface area and volume, profoundly important, whether you're talking about animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, or virtually any living organism out in nature. What we're looking at here is a graph that displays the relationship between surface area and volume of a cube as that cube gets larger. So for example, you can think about a cell, for example, a plant cell, which are often cube-like in shape. If you think about something like that, the point is, as long as it maintains the same shape, but yet gets bigger, what happens to the surface area and volume? Well, of course, both of those factors increase, right? Both surface area increases, as does the volume, but the volume increases proportionately more than does the surface area. So another way to think about this is that not only for a cube, but for any given structure, as long as you maintain the same shape of the structure, as the structure gets bigger, the surface area to volume ratio decreases. And this is profoundly important, and explains in part why living organisms tend to be composed of cells which are very, very tiny in nature. For the smaller the structure in question, the more surface area there is per volume within that structure. So if you think of a cell, think about the surface area of that cell represented by the cell membrane. It's important to have tiny cells because that maximizes the surface area of the cell membrane through which things can move either into or out of a cell. So again, lots of things are moving into or out of cells. You've got nutrients have to get in, waste products have to get out, oxygen has to get into cells, CO2 has to get out. So again, by having cells constructed as tiny structures, that maximizes the surface area to volume ratio. Another fundamental relationship we see in nature is found when we take a look at the relationship between metabolic rate and the size, in other words, volume or mass of any given organism. So for example, we can compare metabolic rates of large organisms, like this elephant toward the right, with that of much smaller organisms, like the organism on the left, and everything in between. And what we see is a very distinct relationship between the volume or the mass of an organism and its metabolic rate. And this also explains why, in part, if you think about many movies that have monsters that claim to be these large creatures that can move around quite quickly, we see why this really just simply isn't feasible. So for example, if you take a look at total metabolic rate of something like an elephant and compare that with a mouse, yes, overall, the total metabolic rate in an elephant will be much higher than that of a mouse. But if you compare these two organisms on a per weight basis, so per gram of tissue, what's the metabolic rate, how much oxygen is being consumed, we see a profoundly different relationship. So this image here represents a graph where we're looking at the mass of these different organisms compared to their mass specific, or in other words, on a per weight basis of their metabolic rates. And again, what we see is a very distinct relationship, and that is the smaller the organism, the higher its mass-specific metabolic rate. And this sort of makes sense if you think about it, because if you take a huge animal like an elephant, it's just virtually impossible, despite its large circulatory system, it's virtually impossible for adequate oxygen and nutrients to be delivered throughout all the cells in the elephant and all the waste products to be removed from those cells in such a massive volume or mass of an organism. So organisms this big simply are unable to maintain high metabolic rates relative to much smaller organisms, where they just simply don't have to worry about the huge volume of tissue that we find in larger organisms. So another fundamental concept that we find displayed in most animals is this idea of homeostasis. In other words, maintaining relatively stable internal conditions. And there are a variety of fundamental features that come into play when homeostasis is maintained within animals. So this serves as a basic model to think about homeostasis. If you think about some examples, you could talk about the pH of your blood. That's maintained at a fairly constant level. The concentration of solutes in your blood, that too is maintained at a fairly constant level. Or you might think about something like your body temperature. Again, that too is maintained at a fairly constant temperature. So homeostatic systems, they tend to involve some basic components. There must be some sensors. These tend to be specialized neurons located throughout your body that can detect something in question. So, for example, if you think about your body temperature, there are specialized neurons that can detect the temperature of your body, and they serve as sensors. They then collect information and send that to some integrator, for example, your brain. So the integrator, whatever that might be, a part of your brain, for example, that collects information from the sensors, and it compares that with some set point. And then, based on the actual temperature of your body, that would trigger some effectors to either raise your body temperature or lower your body temperature depending on the environment that you're in. So more specifically, if we're thinking about thermoregulation in humans, we see this homeostatic mechanism displayed here. So for example, there are sensors, again, specialized neurons located throughout your body. They're found in your skin, your spinal cord, part of your brain. And again, these detect temperature throughout your body. They then send that information to your hypothalamus, right? This is a part of your brain, which serves as an integrator. So this part of your brain takes in all that information, and then depending on whether that detects your body temperature is below or above the set point, namely 98.6, that will trigger various effectors to come into play. So for example, if your body temperature tends to be below the set point, so if you go outside on a cold winter day, what's going to happen? Well, blood vessels near your skin are going to constrict, you might start to shiver, and you might even increase cellular respiration to generate more heat within your body, all of course in an attempt to warm up your body and bring it up to that set point. On the other hand, if your body temperature is too hot, so if you're outdoors on a hot sunny day, well, various other effectors will be triggered to come into action. So blood vessels near your skin might dilate, you're probably going to start to sweat, and you might even start to breathe more, as this can happen in dogs as well, right? They can pant, all in an attempt to get rid of excess heat in order to bring down your body temperature and again, maintain it at that set point. So just one example of how homeostasis is achieved with respect to body temperature within an organism. Along the lines of thermoregulation, there's lots of variation if you look at different animals. People tend to think about two general themes. We tend to think about animals as being warm-blooded or cold-blooded. It's really not quite that simple. So if you think about an animal that represents an endotherm, this is any animal that generates its own body heat. In contrast, ectotherms, these are organisms that essentially absorb heat from their surrounding environment. And so you might loosely say, well, endotherms are warm-blooded animals and ectotherms are cold-blooded animals. But again, it's not quite that simple. There's a bit more to it. So in addition to those concepts, we can also talk about heterotherms and homeotherms. So heterotherms are all those organisms whose body temperature fluctuates. In contrast, homeotherms are those animals whose body temperature remains fairly constant. And so if you think about these concepts, we can think about thermoregulation really as a four-way array. So endotherms toward the top, ectotherms toward the bottom. You can have an endotherm who is also a homeotherm. So for example, humans, right? We generate our own heat and we tend to maintain fairly constant internal body temperatures. You can also have ectotherms, homeotherms as well. For example, if you have fish or invertebrates and other animals that live, for example, in the ocean, in the polar regions, they might be absorbing their heat from the surrounding environment, but they maintain fairly constant, albeit cool, they maintain fairly constant internal body temperatures. So the point is, it's not simply an endotherm-ectotherm system, it's really this four-way system that we should think about. in different animals. Another concept that we're mentioned here relative to thermoregulation, but also can be applied to many other examples in physiology, deals with this basic question of how is heat conserved. If you imagine lots of animals, they not only can survive extremely cold temperatures, but they can actually thrive under these conditions. So there must be lots of mechanisms in place to conserve heat within these types of animals. And you can see things like feathers and other types of insulation, but there are also some more subtle things going on in order to help these types of organisms maintain and conserve body heat. One such example is countercurrent exchange. So countercurrent exchange, again, this is a very general concept that can be applied to many different examples in animal physiology, but again, we're applying it here in terms of heat conservation. It refers to any time you have a system where things, generally we're talking about movement of fluids, things that are located right next to each other, but tend to be flowing in opposite directions. So for example, if you think about a mammal, think about blood being pumped from the heart of the animal down, let's say, through arteries in the leg of that animal. So imagine as blood is flowing down the leg, if we're talking about an animal that's out in a cold environment, as blood moves through the artery of that limb, it will tend to lose heat. Now, of course, some of that heat will just be lost to the surrounding environment, but as blood makes its way back up to the major part of the animal, namely back to the heart through the veins, notice that the veins are located right next to the arteries. So whereas the heat is being lost from the artery, a lot of that heat is being picked back up by the blood in the vein, and it's returned to the heart of the organism. So the bottom line is that a lot of that heat that's lost initially from the artery is picked back up and is retained within the organism. Again, this is an example of countercurrent exchange because here we have fluid, in this case blood, moving right next to each other, but yet in opposite directions. A more extreme example, if we look toward the left, if you look at the tongue of a whale, you see often a single artery, but then totally surrounded by veins. So any heat lost by this artery, most of which is picked up by the veins before it's returned to the heart. So again, just one way that these animals can tend to conserve heat under very cold conditions. So this concludes our